Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amir Engel. I'm the chair of the German department at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I'm also a visiting professor at the Humboldt University in Berlin. Today, I'm talking with Shaul Magid on his 2021 book, Meir Kahane, The Public Life and Political Thought of an American Jewish Radical. Shaul, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Amir.
So I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with at least some aspects of your work, but maybe we start off, and it's a great prerogative of this podcast series, is that the interview can ask the interviewee to introduce himself. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about yourself, about your intellectual biography, where you come from, what have you been working on, just shortly, and where you are.
Okay. Well, I was born in the United States in 1958, and I grew up in the New York suburbs and was part of part of what you would call the American counterculture. And at some point, I decided to go to Israel. I didn't grow up with any real Jewish education. I didn't grow up with any knowledge of Zionism. My family, certainly my grandparents, were Bundists from Eastern Europe. So I went to a working circle summer camp where we learned Yiddish and not Hebrew. And interestingly enough, from 1966 until 1974, I went to the summer camp from 1966 to 74. So through the 67 war, through the Yom Kippur War, and I have no recollection of ever talking about Israel, ever seeing an Israeli flag. So I didn't grow up with any education or baggage, however one wants to look at it, of kind of the Zionist project in Israel. But I went to Israel and fell in love with the country and fell in love with the place, and became part of the late 70s, early 80s Balchuva movement, and became Orthodox and then Haredi, studied in yeshivot in Israel for 5 or 6 years. I lived in Israel for about almost 10 years, from 1980 to the end of 1989. Where I was in yeshiva, and then I kind of moved away from the Haredi world, went to the Hebrew University to study for my MA, and then decided to pursue a PhD in the United States, and moved back in 1989 with my first wife and 3 children to the Boston area, and did a dissertation at Brandeis on Polish Hasidism. And that was really kind of my place within the academic world, which was in Hasidism, is something that I knew because of living in the Haredi world, studying Hasidism and Kabbalah. And then, went into the academic world, had a job at Rice University for a few years in Houston, Texas, went to the Jewish Theological Seminary, and I taught there for 9 years, and I was the chair of the Department of Jewish Philosophy. And then from there went to Indiana University, where my second wife and I both had positions, and was there for 14 years until I moved to Dartmouth and now to Harvard. So I've kind of like been around in a lot of different places, and my work is really kind of more from being Jewish mysticism and Hasidism to Jewish thought, philosophy, theology, and then the contemporary Jewish world. So in 2016, I published a book called American Post-Judaism, which was about post-ethnicity and American Judaism. And there I have a last chapter on the Holocaust, and I wanted to look at a variety of scholars who thought about the Holocaust and were shaped by the Holocaust, but are not classically considered to be post-Holocaust theologians. And there was a section of that chapter on Meir Kahane. Of course, he writes the book Never Again in 1971, and the Holocaust was something that was very, very, very deeply influenced who he was and how he thought about things. He was not a survivor. His parents were not survivors. In fact, he doesn't really have any family survivors of the Holocaust. Most of his family had either moved to Palestine or to America before the onset of the war in 1939. But the whole notion of never again and the Holocaust really was very, very prominent in his thought. And I had a graduate student who wanted to write an MA thesis on history and memory in Meir Kahane after reading that section of the chapter. So we set up a kind of chavruta where we just started twice a week meeting and reading Kahane's writings chronologically from 1959, 1960, up through up through his death. And I came to realize that there's a treasure trove of thought here, that there's a real intellectual project. I think a lot of people, certainly one person, not a lot of people, but one person, when I told them I was working on Meir Kahane's thought, said to me, Meir Kahane doesn't have any thought. He's just a thug. And that was like a very kind of common, it was a common trope, both in America and Israel. And I wrote this book to prove that that was not the case, that there is an intellectual project to Kahane, and a very, very powerful one, and a very compelling one if you agree with certain premises. So I started working on this book, and then got a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship to work at the Center for Jewish History, and I spent 6 months in the archives there, and discovered another treasure trove of data and material. It was the first time I ever worked in archives. I was not an archivist. I'm not really a historian by training. And put together this book about Kahane, making the claim that really to understand Kahane is not to understand his Israeli career, but really to understand him from an American perspective, because his Israeli career on some level is really the coda more than the essence of the project, even though he had a tremendous impact on Israeli society, and regrettably still has an impact on Israeli society, which we could talk about. But he also had a very strong impact on American society and on American Jewry. And in a certain sense, he really is an American Jewish thinker. And that was how I presented him. What I found interesting is a lot of the people in Israel, certainly in terms of reactions to the book, a lot of people in Israel didn't know much about his American career. Where he came from, maybe they knew about the Jewish Defense League, but why was it formed? What was the, Kahane comes into existence in the race and culture wars of the late 60s. He's very much a product of a certain iteration of the American counterculture, a kind of not a progressive left-wing product, a more reactionary right-wing product. But he saw himself in many ways, envisioned himself as in a certain sense, a manifestation of things like the Black Panthers. He has a chapter in his book, The Story of the Jewish Defense League, called The Jewish Panthers. So he didn't really even shy away from that. So I basically felt that the way to understand Kahane, and the way to understand both his success and failure in Israeli society, and why he never really was able to have a successful klita into Israeli society. Like, he never really fully became absorbed. I mean, people used to make fun of the fact that he spoke Hebrew with a very, very heavy American accent, and all of that's true. But there's something else structurally that he was never able to overcome the American categories of race and anti-Semitism. And he tried to translate those categories into Israel. But of course, Israel is a much more complicated culture, because it's not about blacks and whites. I mean, you have the Arab community, you have the Mizrahi community, you have the Ashkenazi community. It's a much more difficult society to traverse, and he was not really able to do it. And I think that was ultimately part of the reason. I think there are two reasons that Israeli political society rejected him, but I think that was one of them.
So you already kind of raised a lot of the points that I'd like to discuss. But let's just to get the clean slate, maybe you could give us just a short biographical sketch of Meir Kahane. Where was he born? What is the major points in his biography, and how does this story end?
Well, he was born in the early 1930s in Brooklyn to a middle-class Jewish family. His father was a rabbi. Charles Kahane was a rabbi, and kind of what I guess we would call now modern Orthodox. It wasn't really called then rabbi. And he grows up. His father was very much a revisionist Zionist. In fact, when Jabotinsky used to come to visit America to raise money, he used to stay in the Kahane house. So Jabotinsky dies in 1940. Kahane was born 1934, so he was about 6 years old. But he talks about having memories of Jabotinsky staying there. So there's some of that that's a part of that. And of course, Benjamin Netanyahu's father, Ben-Zion Netanyahu, was also Jabotinsky's secretary in America. That was the kind of world that he grew up in. But he grew up in a kind of post-war New York middle class Brooklyn world. Went to yeshiva like most other Orthodox kids at that time. Spent a little bit of time at Yeshiva University, but didn't really like it. And he ended up studying in the Mir Yeshiva. And his father was very, very kind of adamant that he study in the Mir Yeshiva, because there were two basic big yeshivot in Brooklyn at that time that were, they're talking about the 1950s, that were yeshivot of children of survivors, or I'm saying children who were survivors who were then young adults. One was Torah Vadas and the other one was the Mir Yeshiva. And he studied in the Mir Yeshiva, and he writes about the fact that when he was in the Mir Yeshiva, him and one other friend were the only two that were Zionists. And they used to make fun of Kahane because he used to go to Yeshiva University to listen to the shiurim of Rav Soloveitchik, and used to make fun of the fact that they were Zionists. He was also in the Beitar Youth, which is the revisionist Zionist youth in Brooklyn at the time. And he comes up, reaches adulthood in the late 1950s, early 1960s, becomes an Orthodox rabbi, worked in a conservative synagogue that he claimed to have, were able to reestablish a mechitza in Queens and another place. Not really very successful. And he was also a sports writer for a Brooklyn Daily magazine. I mean, he was really kind of heading toward a kind of very middling, modern Orthodox life in America. And then the counterculture hits. Kennedy is assassinated. In 1964, he writes an essay about Soviet Jewry, which is actually quite early. And he really, in a certain sense, becomes increasingly radicalized over the course of about 5 or 6 years in the 1960s, especially with the rise of anti-Semitism in the Black nationalist movement. And then his real entrance into the public sphere is in the 1968 Ocean Hill, Brownsville, which is a section of Brooklyn. There was a massive teacher strike, a New York teacher strike, that really shut down the entire New York public school system, which is the biggest public school system in the country at that point. And there were protests in the Ocean Hills, Brownsville district by the parents, who were mostly Black and Puerto Rican, against the teachers, 70% of whom were Jews, which has a lot to do with the GI Bill and the fact that Jews were able to go to college for free after the war, and many of them became teachers. That's a whole story. And there was all this anti-Semitic pamphlets that were coming out by the Black and Puerto Rican parents against Albert Shanker, who was then the kind of superintendent of schools, who was not only was a Jew, but also marched with King and Selma, very kind of prominent figure. And Kahane kind of jumps into action, and he establishes the Jewish Defense League in May of 1968 as a way of countering the anti-Semitism in these Black communities and the ways in which those communities had many apartment houses of elderly Jews who were being harassed and mugged and beaten up by Black youths. And so basically, the Jewish Defense League became a kind of vigilante organization that was going around, basically trying to protect Jews and synagogues from anti-Semitism. And he comes into prominence then, and he was very much of a publicity seeker, right? Getting into the New York Times was the gold standard for him, and he becomes a kind of regional and then ultimately national figure for Jewish pride. And then in 1960, at the end of 1969, he decides that the Jewish Defense League has to focus all of its attention on Soviet Jewry, which is kind of interesting because that's how he makes his mark, right? But the interesting thing about the Soviet Jewry is founded by someone named Yaakov Birnbaum in Washington Heights in 1964. And Kahane writes a very short essay and then says nothing about Soviet Jewry until 1960. But once he enters into Soviet Jewry, he becomes the basic voice of Soviet Jewry. Dissonance, civil disobedience, getting arrested, all of these kinds of things. And he becomes a national figure as a result of that. And then just to kind of end the story, he's put on trial for arms smuggling. He started a camp called Camp Jedel, which was like a Jewish militaristic camp, which is kind of like what it's kind of an American version of what Gadna is. I mean, this program where these American kids go to Israel and they go into this kind of, military thing. So he had this camp in the Catskills, and he was arrested for smuggling arms across state lines and was convicted and given a suspended sentence. And after that conviction, he moves to Israel, largely because some say he knew that he was going to be indicted by the FBI on more serious charges.
So let's just finish the biographical sketch.
Yeah.
He comes to Israel 1971.
September 71. His family comes a few months earlier. He immigrates because he had to stay for the trial, 1971. And then in 1972 or 73, he has to come back to America and serve almost a year in prison because of issues of parole that he didn't abide by. So he spends a year in prison in Pennsylvania after he had already moved to Israel. But by that time, he was already living in Israel, and he spends about half his time in Israel and half his time in the U.S. because the Jewish Defense League continues to exist.
And then he forms a political party, KACH.
He forms a political party. He writes a book called Our Challenge, which he actually wrote in English in 1973, which is really, if someone wants to know what is the early political program of Kahane, they should read his book, Our Challenge, where he kind of sets out his political project and founds this party, which is not very successful. But it's important to know that in the early years, before he actually spends a year in prison in Ramla in the 80s, for sedition, in the early years, he's arrested something like within the first 5 years he's in Israel, something like 60 times for all kinds of things, protesting, armed stuff. So he's trying to kind of he's trying to build a movement in Israel and eventually founds a political party. He tries to become elected to the Knesset twice and fails. And then in the third time, he is elected in 1984. And with one mandate.
Right. And so what happens then, just to finish up the story?
Yeah, so we'll finish up the story. So what happens then is it's actually very fascinating. So Kahane becomes a parliamentarian. He is a transferist. He's somebody who really sees that the relationship between the Jews and the Arabs is a zero-sum game. It's either us or them. Strangely enough, that's become a much more common, post-October 7th, that's become a much more common idea. And eventually, this is an interesting kind of tidbit, because in 1985, there was a poll that was taken. This is like the year after he was elected. There was a poll that was taken in Israel by a very reputable polling organization that polled that if the elections were held now, he would get 11 seats. And this kind of set the political landscape on fire. And this really, some say, initiated the racism law that was passed by the Knesset, which was specifically for him, to oust him. So it wasn't the fact that he was just elected as one mandate. It was the fact that the Israeli political culture saw that this was actually becoming a very popular thing. And they end up passing the law. He's ousted from the Knesset. He appeals the law to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upholds it. And the interesting tidbit to this is also that by that time, and this is something that we can get to more later, it's not just the center and the left that turns against him. The Israeli right turns against him also. Geula Cohen turns against him. Menachem Begin turns against him. Yitzhak Shamir turns against him. I mean, the people who really were closest to his views basically saw he's a danger to Israeli society. And therefore, it was because of the right wing turning against him that they were able to pass the law to oust him.
He ends his life in violent circumstances.
So he, spends the rest of his life going back and forth to America. But by the time that happens in America, he really is almost a persona non grata. It's hard for him to get speaking engagements. And he gave a talk at a Marriott hotel in Manhattan on a Saturday night, and he was assassinated by an Egyptian assailant who was able to escape and then was captured, and then, interestingly enough, was acquitted because of some strange gun charge. And years later, this same person, whose name I've forgotten for some reason, this same person was arrested and convicted as being part of another terrorist attack in America, connected with Al-Qaeda. And it was only after he was convicted that he then admitted that he killed Kahane. Right. So some people want to say that Kahane was really the first victim of Al-Qaeda.
So now it would be quite remarkable to note that the first chapter of your book is titled Liberalism. And to make the issue more peculiar, you write the first sentence of this chapter is, "This book is not really about Meir Kahane." So the next question is, why are you interested in this topic of liberalism in the context, and why do you choose to set up the book by saying that this is not a book about Meir Kahane?
I say that because, it obviously is about Meir Kahane, but it's not only about Meir Kahane. Kahane felt that the real enemy of the Jews was liberalism. And not only liberalism in America, but liberalism in Israel. And his basic attack against the Israeli political society was that Israel it was trying to kind of, in a certain sense, mirror the American liberalism, which in America will destroy the Jew, not through violence, but through assimilation. And the liberalism in Israel will ultimately destroy the Jewish state. Kahane was one of the first to say openly from the right that Jewish and democratic is what he called schizophrenic. There is no possibility of Jewish and democratic, which again, interestingly enough, if we go, jump to 2024, there are more and more people on the right that are actually also saying that. But there were people on the left that were saying Jewish and democratic wasn't possible in Israel at the time. This is like, when Jewish and democratic gets put in the 80s. But Kahane was saying it from the right. So in a certain sense, what I wanted to look at was Kahane as a Jewish critique of liberalism in a broad sense.
Right. So, but then you make the point, if I remember correctly, you make the point that liberalism was, in the 1960s, the basic kind of staple of Jewish ideology, Jewish self-perception in the United States.
Oh, for sure it was, yeah. And that was, in a certain sense, that was that's why he attacked it so viciously, because he saw the way in which liberalism was going to be the end of Judaism and Jews in America. I'll give you a couple of examples. So in the 1970s, and then a little bit later in the 1980s, you have the rise of kind of neoconservatism, which many Jews were involved in, and many Jews are leader of the Commentary Magazine, Jad Pan Haaretz, and so on and so forth. And they, interestingly enough, the neoconservatives who also saw liberalism as the problem, and Kahane, who saw liberalism as the problem, knew about each other, but they had no contact with each other. In other words, they were just a subway ride away from the Upper West Side of Manhattan to Flatbush in Brooklyn. And Kahane talks about reading Commentary Magazine, and he talks about submitting essays to Commentary Magazine, none of which were accepted. So he saw the connection, but they didn't want to have anything to do with him because the neoconservatives were mostly secular. And Kahane was nominally, I mean, he was an Orthodox Jew, but his base was a religious base. So I think you have within neoconservatism and Kahanism two iterations of Jewish critiques of liberalism that I think in today's world, with, for example, the modern Orthodox turn towards Trump and towards evangelicalism, you have a merging of the neoconservative critique of liberalism and the Kahanist critique of liberalism in our world.
I see similar things in Muslim circles as well, right? The second chapter of your book moves from liberalism, which sets up the stage for this kind of to contrast what's going on with Kahane, to the second chapter, which is actually called radicalism, and you try to talk about Kahane as a radical thinker, and you try to contrast him to other radical thinkers. So let's set the stage. What do you mean by the term radical? Who are the radicals? In what sense is Kahane radical?
I think it's interesting, maybe important to note that the term radicalism, when Kahane comes into prominence in the late 60s, was really for many a badge of honor. I mean, now the term is considered to be somewhat pejorative. You know, you're a radical or a radical view. But radicalism in the 60s was really, in a certain sense, the anti-war student movement, black nationalism, the Young Lords, the kind of Hispanic ethnic movement. These were kind of movements on the left that were very influenced by Marxism, but were radical in that they saw that the only way to solve the problem of inequality and racism was by revolutionary means. So when I'm thinking about Freddie Hampton of the Black Panthers, I'm thinking about Malcolm X, I'm thinking about these thinkers who really saw themselves as revolutionaries, and I really think that Kahane saw himself as a revolutionary. He did not want to incrementally change society. He wanted to transform it. He wanted to overturn it. And I think his revolutionary qualities is what brought the right wing in Israel to turn against him. I think even people like Begin, who himself was a revolutionary when he was younger, but no longer when he was at that time, Begin and Shamir and Geula Cohen, they saw that, wait a second, this guy Kahane wants to overthrow the country. He doesn't want to just promote these right-wing ideas. He wants to actually overthrow the government. And I think that they're right about that. I think that he always was a revolutionary. That's where he drew his energy. That's where he drew his kind of influence. And I think that continued into Israel, which ultimately was his demise. However, I think it's also the reason of his resurgence. Is because I think groups like the Hilltop Youth and groups like the radical right in Israel today are also revolutionaries, and they're also turning against the state. And in a certain sense, they're coming back to Kahane through some different, more homegrown Israeli Sabra means.
Yeah, so I really want to hear you talk about this topic more, about the kind of afterlife of Meir Kahane and contemporary Israel and perhaps beyond. But I would like to go back to the 1960s and talk about race. I mean, this is obviously a very complicated and kind of discussed issue in the 1960s in the United States, and this is the backdrop for, as you described, Kahane's race theories. You have some kind of discussion about the use of the term and terminology. How do you understand Kahane's race ideology?
That's a good question. That chapter became kind of part of another project I'm working on called Judeo-pessimism. I think I actually used that term, drawing from Afro-pessimism and critical race theory and trying to understand the race theory for Kahane. I think there were a number of different pieces. The first one is Kahane. We could start going back to 1904, where W.E.D. Du Bois in The Souls of Black Folk says that, Western civilization, and in particular America, it's always about the color line. It's always black and white. And I think that kind of moves through the 20th century, that when you think about inequality in America, when you think about persecution and oppression in America, you have to think about it in terms of the color line. And it created a certain challenge for Jews in America, where they were living in a society which may have been the first for many of them, where the Jews were not the most othered other. It was always about black and white. Yes, there was anti-Semitism. Yes, the Jew was marginalized, but it was never the same way. And so I think that what happens with Kahane is, once civil rights happens, once the race wars start, the Watts riots in 1965, the founding of the assassination of Malcolm X, the founding of the Black Panther Party, the founding of black nationalism, on the one hand, you have a certain radical movement of revolutionary activity to oppose racism, which he actually was sympathetic to, except he thought that blacks were anti-Semites. And in a certain sense, he thought that the anti-racism was getting too much play and taking away from the anti-Semitism. And that actually those that were the victims of racism, meaning the black community, because he's living in urban New York, which Jews and blacks are living cheek by jowl, the victims of race are also the perpetrators of anti-Semitism. And that's what happens in the 1968 school
demonstrations and
strikes. Demonstrations in school. So basically, he wants to take the anti-racism, or to take the problem of race and put it within the realm of anti-Semitism, that there's white anti-Semitism, but really the anti-Semitism of the left, the anti-Semitism of the people of color, what we call now people of color, was really a bigger problem, which again, going to the campus protests in 2023, 2024, that has come back. Somehow the American establishment has really adopted Kahane's basic view that anti-Semitism on the left is more dangerous than anti-Semitism on the right.
And worsen racism.
Yeah.
In many cases.
Right. Because because in a sense, Jews are white, and therefore they're seen negatively by the people of color, and white Christian America is also anti-Semitic, so that the Jews are getting it from both sides.
Right. Interesting. Does that mean, I'm just asking I'm curious about the conceptualization. Did Kahane essentially understand Judaism as a race as well, or? He
says he doesn't. He has an essay, I can't remember the title of it, that he published in the Jewish Week about a black convert to Judaism, and basically made the claim that a black convert to Judaism is as Jewish as a native-born Jew, and I would allow my daughter to marry a black convert to Judaism. I don't remember the title of the essay. So, but it's a kind of like the essay itself is already begging the question. People say to me, well, was Kahane a racist? And my response is, of course, America's racist. It's not. He basically claimed that, for example, he spoke out very strongly against the movement for reparations from slavery, right? That the Jews should get reparations, the blacks shouldn't get reparations. right? And we Jews certainly should not give blacks reparations because we weren't living in America during slavery, which of course doesn't make a difference. I mean, the fact that Jews in America are beneficiaries of white, privilege is something that's not a very provocative thing to say. Although nowadays it's become more and more provocative to say, which I think brings us back to the fact that Kahane is becoming resurrected again in all kinds of ways, right? I mean, I start the book with an anecdote of being at the bat mitzvah of my niece in Chicago, in a suburb of Chicago, and I'm standing next to this very, average modern Orthodox Jew, probably in his early 50s, and he asks me, like, what do you do? I told him I'm a professor. What are you working on? I told him I'm working on a book on Kahane. And he says to me, and there's a person that doesn't know me, right? He says to me, well, if you want to know what I think, everything Kahane said was right, and everything he predicted came true, and he just should have said it in a nicer way. And this is a regular, average, suburban, modern Orthodox Jew in 2014, right? Speaking to somebody who he had never met before, right? But that there was that becomes the opening anecdote of the book. It's like, oh, I have to write this book because of that guy, right?
Does Kahane have anything interesting to say about the sources or the origins of Jewish hatred? Because within this metric, it raised a question. So, what is it about Jews that made them the kind of the objective of so much historical hate?
Right.
Or is it just kind of mainstream, kind of the regular?
No, I think it's more than that. I think for Kahane, and he talks about this in Never Again, and he talks about this in a number of other books. He talks about this in The Jewish Idea, which is a kind of like magnum opus, is the Harayon Yehudi. That's the book that most people in Israel read when they read Kahane. He thought that anti-Semitism was metaphysical, theological. Esav Sonet Yaakov, that this is the way of the world, right? That there is no way to eradicate anti-Semitism because anti-Semitism is embedded in the DNA of the Gentile. And the only thing Jews can do is manage anti-Semitism through violence, or at least the threat of violence. So that in a sense, this whole idea of why does anti-Semitism happen? How do you get rid of anti-Semitism? For Kahane, all of those questions were completely futile. Anti-Semitism is the way that God created the world, and that the Jew can only protect themselves through power.
So all this business about making the situation better through politics is just niceties that liberals tell themselves in order to sleep better at night.
Exactly. Right. I mean, for Kahane, liberals, the liberal error is that anti-Semitism is sociological, circumstantial. I mean, he adopts this notion that Hannah Arendt talks about. She talks about it critically, the idea of eternal anti-Semitism, right? She writes against that idea. For Kahane, that's the basic template of civilization.
So we're moving a little bit on, and the fact is that there is indeed an ideology that sees the role of Jews in the world and in world history as unique and special, and tries to allot them a place under the sun where they can, manage anti-Semitism with force, and that is Zionism and the State of Israel. What is Kahane's appreciation of Zionism? What is his story with Israeli politics? How does this evolve?
I mean, obviously, Kahane is born into a Zionist family, a revisionist Zionist family. He's very much a product of that. I think what ends up happening is that he becomes what I call in the book a kind of militant post-Zionist. By 1986, when the Knesset rules legislates the racism law, he writes a book called Uncomfortable Questions for Comfortable Jews, and it's basically his response to the racism law. And he basically argues that, in a certain sense, Zionism is a failed project. It's a failed project because it attempts to replicate a kind of liberal democratic politics for Israel and the Jews, which can't be democratic. He didn't believe in democracy for Israel. He believed in democracy for everybody else. I mean, he writes a book called Time to Go Home, which is his swan song to America. He says America is the greatest country that the Jews have ever lived in, and the democracy protected them, and so on and so forth, but ultimately will turn against them. So he was in favor of democracy, except when it came to the Jews. And his problem with democracy, his problem with Zionism was the very notion of Zionism as the normalization of the Jew, becoming kekol hagoyim. That for Kahane, true Jewish politics is the abnormality of the Jew and the abnormality of the Jewish state. And the Jewish state can't be democratic because if it's democratic, it's not a Jewish state. And the Arabs are the enemy because they are the natural enemy of the Jews, just like other Goyim are the natural enemy of the Jews, except with the Arab population, it's different because they actually live there. And the only solution to have a Jewish state is to basically get rid of the Arabs. And this was something, notions of transfer that you saw in the Techiyah Party, Bulakon. This is something that was quite radical in the 70s. But it's shockingly less radical now.
I'm wondering about the metaphysical aspect of all this, because it seems to me that what you're saying is that for Kahane, this worldview is rooted in a certain metaphysics about the place of certain peoples in the kind of metaphysical history of the world, in the spiritual history of the world, whatever. This is the way it is, which is a true contrast to most of the right-wing ideologists of the 1980s that say, well, there is a conflict. We need a revisionist position that sees the Arabs as kind of the enemy. In a kind of a mundane sense, just there is a struggle for land, there is a struggle for resources, and there is a fight, and that's just the way it is. Here, there is a real metaphysical worldview that is kind of rooted in certain understanding of the universe and its history, or something on this level. Does he ground these ideas in scripture, in I don't know, in Kabbalah, in anything within the Jewish history? He just makes it up as he goes.
Well, there are two things that are worth noting here. First of all, one of the interesting things about thinking about Kahane from our perspective is that he seemed to have no interest in Rav Kook at all. He rarely mentions Rav Kook. There's one photograph of him and Tzvi Yehuda Kook from 1971 when he comes to visit his son who's studying in Merkaz Harav. But Rav Kook's metaphysical, romantic notion of this is the beginning of redemption, and basically Rav Kook speaks very strongly, the elder, against violence, because, and even Tzvi Yehuda Kook also really speaks against violence, because we're living in the redemptive era, and God will take care of everything. We just have to settle the land and build the land. Rav Kook, Kahane didn't believe he didn't have any patience for that. He didn't have a mystical romantic bone in his body. He was a empiricist. The only thing that mattered was what it was right in front of him, and what mattered to him was power and conquest. Now, he has no interest in Kabbalah, although he does have a strong interest in Musar, which I can talk about in a moment. I think the first iteration of this kind of metaphysical ideology comes out in a book that he wrote called Arba'im Shana, 40 years, the year that he was in Ramla prison. And he makes this argument that 40 years from the time of Matan Torah, from the time of the giving of the Torah and so it's going to be 40 years from 1948. In other words, the Jews have 40 years to figure out this project. And if they don't figure it out, God will come and destroy them. And the book is basically a commentary to the prophet Ezekiel. And basically, the argument that he makes from Ezekiel, who's a very angry prophet, as we know, is that the Jews have to basically control, empower, and act violently against the Arabs. And if they don't do that, God will act violently against the Jews. And Ezekiel, Ezekiel kind of says that about, I mean, he's not talking about the Arabs also, obviously, but Ezekiel is basically, no, God is going to intervene and destroy you. Right. And it's going to be very violent. And it's not violence against the other. It's violence against the Jews. And so Kahane is basically saying that we are now on the precipice of the 40 years from the establishment of the state. And if we don't conquer the land of Israel and establish a monarchy, which is what he was in favor of, then Ezekiel's prophecy will come true and the Jews will be destroyed. So that's the first part of it, into 84. And then indeed the Jewish Idea, which is a long book, it's a 700-page Hebrew book, 1,000 pages in English, 2 big volumes, which he apparently had been writing for decades. He basically tries to kind of suss out this kind of ideology through his reading of scripture and Chazal.
So tell us more about this book, because this leads up right to my next question.
Right.
The
So
Jewish idea.
Yeah, right. So the Jewish Idea is basically the magnum opus of Kahane's project through the lens of the tradition. Mostly scriptural, but also rabbinic, right? And obviously he's picking and choosing the kind of rabbinic passages that he wants that are going to support the idea. And the way that my thesis in that chapter is that, Kahane studied in the Mir Yeshiva for 13 years, right? So he spent a lot of time in the Mir Yeshiva. Now, the Mir Yeshiva was not formally a Musar Yeshiva, but if you think about the kind of, extra Talmudic studies in the Mir Yeshiva, it was very influenced by certain kinds of Musar thinkers. And I think that this Jewish book, The Jewish Idea, is kind of like a Musar book for Jewish collectivity, where Musar is really focused on the individual, kind of the ethical, moral perfection of the individual. Basically, the Jewish Idea is a book about the I wouldn't necessarily call it moral or ethical, but the evolution and the perfection of the Jewish collective body. And that is to be able to own up to the reality that the land of Israel belongs to the Jews. The Arabs don't have a place there unless they're willing to live in a second-class status, and the process of Musar is that the Jew has to cleanse themselves from Western liberal ideology.
So we come circle to the kind of neoconservatism.
Yes, right. I mean, it really is the liberalism is really what is going to destroy the Jew, whether it's as a minority or as a majority.
Can you say more about this connection between Musar and this and this ideology, this metaphysical ideology of strife and hatred and
Well,
struggle.
He offers a kind of counter history. So if you look at, for example, the history the history of, let's say, diasporic Judaism or exilic Judaism, right? You could say, okay, it starts maybe Rabbi Akiva as the quintessential rabbinic figure, as the martyr. He dies at the hands of the Romans, right, to save Torah, right? And then you have this whole kind of rabbinic ethos of a certain kind of exilic diasporic mentality, whereas kind of says, he says, I'm going to offer a counter history where the real heroes are Bar Kokhba and Bar Giora. That's where it starts, and it goes from there to Lehi.
So it is actually a history of strife and struggle and violence.
And violence, exactly. And the fact that the rabbis marginalized Bar Kokhba and didn't focus on the insurrection and didn't focus on the Hasmonean revolt, but focused on the study of Torah, was an errant history that he's trying to correct.
They're too liberal, basically.
Right. He has this book called Listen World, Listen Jew, which is his total revisionist history of Jewish militarism that was written as a response to a Academy Award speech that Vanessa Redgrave gave in 1978, where she mentioned Zionist hooligans because the JDL tried to petition for her not to win an Academy Award for a movie called Julia, which was about the Holocaust, which she did win because Vanessa Redgrave had promoted a film made about the Palestinians. So the JDL in Los Angeles tried to petition the Academy not to give her the award. She gets the award, and then she basically talks about the Zionist hooligans, which was really the JDL. And so he writes a book called Listen World, Listen Jew, which originally was called Listen Vanessa, Listen Jew, and then it was changed later on.
And the point is to show the historical struggle of the Jews as the kind of the military history of the Jews, or the
exactly
the violent history.
Right, that the true history of the Jew is a history of militancy,
and not this kind of meek Galuti exile Jew that only sought to find a way to keep the halacha and stay alive somehow.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, in a way, it's Jabotinsky, except that Jabotinsky's secularism gets translated through the lens of tradition.
Right. So this leads me to the last question I have about Kahane, but I think it's already foreseen. Talk to us a little bit about the afterlife of Kahane and his thought in today's political worldview in Israel, but maybe not also beyond.
I mean, in Israel, it's sadly obvious. I mean, a lot of people talk about Ben Gvir and Smotrich as Kahanas. I've written in a number of places and spoken about the fact that I don't think that Ben Gvir is really a Kahanist. I think he's a neo-Kahanist. And I think it's interesting that when Ben Gvir becomes elected to the Knesset, Baruch Marzel, who really is one of the Kahanists, said, oh, Ben Gvir is not really a Kahanist. And Marzel was right. And the reason why Marzel was right is because Ben Gvir is not a revolutionary. Ben Gvir is somebody that wants to work within the system. And he is working within the system. And he's not trying to overthrow the government. Not in the way that Kahane wanted. So in a sense, Ben Gvir is more dangerous because Kahane was outright a revolutionary, and then eventually even the right rejected him. Whereas someone like Ben Gvir, Smotrich, and others, they're saying, no, we'll work within the system. We'll slowly transform the ethos of the culture toward us, and which is why, tragically, I mean, I wouldn't say it if others didn't say it, but there were kind of far rightists who were celebrating celebrating October 7th.
Yeah.
Saying this is a great moment, right? This is the moment we've been waiting for, because now we can actually do what we always wanted to do, and now we have the people behind us.
Yes.
Right. So I think. Go ahead. Good.
I was wondering about the marriage between the metaphysical kind of history of strife that you talked about and the Cookian view of history, or Cookian view of halacha, right? If there is kind of a in today's Israeli right-wing movement, is there a resurgence of these two movements where the Kahanist worldview is held somehow, but then it's given depth with sources, Kabbalistic sources, and so forth?
Certainly, that's true. You can find that in a number of different places. But I think there's another point worth mentioning, that the Cookian vision really comes into prominence after 1967, and the reason that it's able to establish itself after 1967 in a largely nonviolent way. I mean, you have the Jewish underground. I mean, you have other things happening in the 80s, but largely nonviolent is because 1967 was understood as the kind of the divine intervention in the stage of redemption. And so God was doing all of that work. So the Jews didn't have to be violent toward the Arabs. I mean, they dominated them, but they didn't have to be violent toward them because God was to do the work. And then Kahane kind of recedes a little bit. Once things like a two-state solution, later Oslo, once that community sees that, wait a second, it's moving in the different direction, that's when the militarism comes in. That's when the proactive violence comes in. We have to now intervene into the government or the society moving away from the post-67 world. And so you see that you can see that in the Jewish underground. You can see it in the Hilltop Youth. You can see it in places like Amona. And then ultimately you get to the point, and this is really, really interesting because people talk a lot about 2005 Gaza, and people like Rav Shagar say, well, the disengagement from Gaza was the great Nakba for religious Zionism. But there's another Gaza that people don't talk about, and that's the Gaza of the Hitnakut from Yamit, of the disengagement from Yamit, and Kahane was alive then, right? And in a certain sense, these kinds of things where the government is going to intervene to take Jews out of their homes in Yamit and in Gaza in 2005, this, in a sense, triggers the militancy, right? And now what ends up happening, and this is a classic Kahanist move, especially 2005, the state becomes the enemy. And that's what we're seeing, and that's what we started yesterday in Teitelbaum, right? We're seeing really iterations where within a segment of the community, of the Jewish community, the state has now become the enemy. And basically, and this is very Kahanist, because he did think that the liberal state was the enemy. But now even the illiberal state is the enemy.
Well, the state still represents the liberal, whatever is left of the liberal ideology. The very idea of state is a liberal idea. Now we have like kind of proto militias that are kind of trying to form and find their position within the political sphere and the public sphere. Thank you very much for this conversation. Maybe you could say with a few words just to finish off, what are you working on now?
Well, I just finished a book on the political theology of Yoel Teitelbaum of Satmar, to go from the other, and for those that'll think that there's something dissonant between writing a book about Kahane and writing a book about Yoel Teitelbaum, in a feshbah for David Novak that just came out, I have an article because David Novak wrote a book called Judaism and Zionism, A New Perspective, and I have an article on David Novak, Meir Kahane, and Yoel Teitelbaum of Satmar on Judaism and Zionism, and I really put them in conversation with each other. So I finished that book, and now I've really been working of late on Aaron Shmuel Tamaris, and going through some of his writings from the early 20th century, and his especially Knesset Yisrael, L'Milchomot HaGoyim, which is a book that he wrote in response to the First World War. And I give a Zoom shir every Thursday night on Tamaris's writing. So hopefully one day I'll write something about Tamaris.
Okay. Sounds fascinating as well. We're very much looking for that, and I want to thank you again so much. We were discussing Meir Kahane, the public life and political thought of an American Jewish radical. Shaul Magid, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Amin.